This is the unknown zone, where truth is stranger than fiction and history hides stories you were never meant to hear. During World War II, there was an army that didn't fight with bullets or bombs. Their weapons were sound, art, and illusion. They painted tanks that weren't real, broadcast battles that never happened, and marched through Europe as ghosts. This is the true story of the Ghost Army, the artists who fooled the Nazis. In the final years of World War II, as the Allies fought to liberate Europe from Nazi control, a secret American unit was created unlike any other in history. It had no heavy weapons, no infantry, and no conventional training. Its mission was not to destroy the enemy, but to deceive them. Officially, it was known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. Unofficially, it would be remembered as the Ghost Army. The Ghost Army was born from desperation and imagination. By 1944, the war in Europe was reaching a turning point. The Allied forces had landed at Normandy and were pushing toward Germany, but the front lines stretched thin. The Germans still held strong positions, and every Allied victory came at a terrible cost. The High Command knew that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. They needed to outthink the enemy, to manipulate their movements, to confuse their intelligence, and to control what they believed was real. The idea for such a unit had roots in earlier deception successes. The British had already mastered large-scale illusions through operations like Fortitude, creating phantom armies that fooled Hitler about D-Day. American strategists took those lessons and decided to build something even more audacious. A unit whose sole purpose was to impersonate entire divisions and mislead the German army across the battlefields of Europe. Recruitment for the Ghost Army began quietly in early 1944, but the men they sought were not ordinary soldiers. They didn't look for sharpshooters or demolition experts. They wanted artists, architects, engineers, and sound designers. Men who could think creatively, build illusions, and bring fiction to life. Many were students from the nation's leading art schools, Yale, Pratt, Cooper Union. Some were painters, others were designers, photographers, or set builders. They had been trained to create beauty, but in war, they were asked to create deception. The unit was commanded by Colonel Harry Reeder, but its true creative leadership came from men like Major Ralph Ingersoll and Captain Fred Fox, both of whom had backgrounds in advertising and design. They understood the psychology of persuasion, how to make people believe what they saw and heard. Together, they began to design a new kind of warfare. The Ghost Army's power came from three elements: visual deception, sonic illusion, and radio simulation. Each element had its own specialized team. The visual deception team was responsible for creating entire fake divisions out of rubber and canvas. They designed inflatable tanks, jeeps, artillery, and even aircraft. From a distance or in a reconnaissance photo, these decoys looked completely real. Soldiers would arrange them in fields, aligning them with realistic tracks and camouflage nets. They even used portable compressors to inflate the tanks in minutes, creating the illusion of a massive armored force appearing overnight. The sound unit, led by engineers from the Bell Telephone Laboratories and Hollywood's sound specialists, used state-of-the-art recording technology to create realistic battlefield soundscapes. They recorded tanks rumbling, trucks moving, men shouting orders, and even the clatter of machinery. Using huge speakers mounted on half-tracks, they could project these sounds for miles. The Germans would hear what sounded like an advancing army and prepare for an attack that never came. The radio deception team, trained in the techniques of the Signal Corps, mimicked the communication patterns of real divisions. They sent false transmissions, replicated the speech habits of specific officers, and built entire networks of fake chatter. To German intelligence, the signals were indistinguishable from genuine military communications. Together, these three units could simulate the presence of tens of thousands of men. They could make a single company appear as an entire corps. They could create divisions where none existed, and make real divisions vanish into thin air. The Ghost Army first deployed in France shortly after the D-Day invasion. Their early missions were small but effective. They practiced setting up their inflatable equipment, testing sound projection, and synchronizing their operations with real frontline movements. The first major operation came in late July 1944, near the French town of Saint-Lô. Allied forces were preparing for Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy, and needed to mislead the Germans about where the main attack would occur. The Ghost Army was sent to stage a fake build-up south of the front, simulating the presence of an entire armored division. Under the cover of night, they moved into position. By dawn, fields that had been empty the day before were filled with tanks, trucks, and artillery. The sound team began playing recordings of engines and gunfire, and the radio team transmitted coded chatter describing non-existent troop movements. Local civilians, unaware of the deception, reported to German spies that a large American force had arrived. The Germans responded by diverting units away from the real front, exactly as planned. It worked. Operation Cobra succeeded, and the breakout from Normandy began. The Ghost Army had proven its worth. Over the next months, their operations grew in scale and sophistication. They followed the advancing Allied front, staging diversions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. Each mission had its own code name: Operation Elephant, Operation Bettenberg, Operation Brest. In total, they would conduct more than 20 major deceptions. One of their most daring operations took place in September 1944, near the Moselle River. The U.S. 4th Armored Division was preparing to cross, but needed time and secrecy. The Ghost Army moved in first, posing as the 4th Division. They set up hundreds of inflatable tanks along the riverbank, played recorded sounds of bridge construction, and transmitted fake radio orders. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the scene and confirmed the division's presence. When the real 4th Division crossed the river miles away, the Germans were completely fooled. The danger for the Ghost Army was constant. Though their weapons were fake, the bullets fired at them were real. On several occasions, their decoy camps drew German artillery fire, meant for real units. They had to move quickly, set up illusions, and vanish before the enemy could discover the trick. They were actors on a deadly stage, performing under fire. For many of the young artists in the unit, the war became both terrifying and surreal. They painted camouflage by day and sketched the aftermath of battle by night. Some kept journals and drawings that would later reveal the emotional cost of their work. They were deceivers, but also witnesses. Artists capturing the strange intersection of creativity and destruction. Despite the secrecy of their mission, the men of the Ghost Army formed a close bond. Their humor and ingenuity kept them alive. They played pranks, built sculptures, and improvised constantly. They were soldiers and showmen, stage designers in a theater of war. Every operation was a performance, and the audience was the German army. By the end of 1944, the Ghost Army had become a crucial part of the Allied deception network. Their illusions saved lives, disrupted enemy movements, and created opportunities for real armies to strike. But their greatest test was yet to come, a mission that would put everything they had learned to the ultimate test. By the winter of 1944, the Ghost Army had already performed the impossible. They had created armies from air, drawn enemy fire onto illusions, and saved thousands of soldiers through deception. But the war was far from over. Germany, though retreating, was still dangerous and unpredictable. The Allies were pressing toward the Rhine River, the last great barrier before the heart of Germany. Every step forward was costly, and the Germans were preparing a counterattack that would shock the world. For the men of the Ghost Army, this would be their most dangerous season. They were about to step into the middle of chaos, where even a single mistake could mean death. After the success of the Normandy breakout, the unit had followed the front eastward. Each new deception brought them closer to enemy territory. They were no longer staging operations in safe rear areas. Now they were within artillery range, sometimes only a few miles from German lines. Their job remained the same: create illusions so convincing that German commanders would move their forces in the wrong direction. But now, the stakes were higher than ever. In September 1944, near the town of Metz in northeastern France, the Ghost Army was ordered to stage a massive diversion. The real U.S. 6th Armored Division was preparing to move south, but the Germans couldn't be allowed to know. The Ghost Army's task was to impersonate the division and hold its position, using nothing but sound, light, and rubber. For days the men worked in the rain and mud, setting up hundreds of inflatable tanks and artillery pieces. They strung up fake telephone lines, erected wooden signs with unit names, and parked decoy jeeps in visible positions. The sound engineers broadcasted recorded noises of engines, truck convoys, and even soldiers shouting across encampments. From the German side of the lines, everything looked and sounded authentic. But the danger was real. German spotters began to notice the activity and called in artillery fire. Explosions rained down across the fields, tearing holes in the decoy tanks. The men took cover, laughing nervously as shrapnel shredded the canvas walls of their rubber army. When the shelling stopped, they patched the holes, re-inflated the tanks, and went back to work. The illusion had to survive. Even if they didn't, their success at Metz bought the real armored divisions time to reposition. Once again, the Germans had been deceived, and the Allied lines held firm. In the months that followed, the Ghost Army carried out more than a dozen similar missions. Each one was different. Sometimes they impersonated divisions that were nowhere near the front. Other times, they faked retreats or withdrawals to draw the enemy into traps. They became experts in improvisation. Every soldier learned how to play a role. When stationed near civilians, they were told to act like the units they were impersonating, change their shoulder patches, alter their slang, even adopt new habits. An engineer pretending to be part of an armored division might complain loudly about tanks that didn't exist. A radio operator might talk about supply shortages or weather delays, just to give spies the right kind of gossip. The deception was total, visual, auditory, psychological. One of their most remarkable feats came in December 1944 during the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. It was the last major German push of the war, a desperate attempt to split the Allied forces. Caught off guard, the Allies scrambled to stabilize their lines. Amid the confusion, the Ghost Army was called into action to cover exposed positions and simulate reinforcements. They were sent into freezing forests near Luxembourg, where temperatures dropped far below zero. The men trudged through snow, carrying inflatable tanks that cracked in the cold. They set up fake artillery batteries, lit decoy campfires, and blasted recordings of armored units moving through the woods. To the Germans listening on their intercept radios, it sounded like American divisions were regrouping for a counterattack. In reality, the real divisions were retreating and reorganizing miles away. For several nights, the Ghost Army worked under the constant threat of discovery. German patrols roamed nearby, and snipers occasionally fired into the darkness. Every sound had to be timed, every movement calculated. A misplaced light or a wrong transmission could reveal the entire deception, but they never slipped. Their work during the Battle of the Bulge helped stabilize the crumbling Allied flank. By drawing attention and artillery fire away from real positions, they gave commanders time to regroup and strike back. It was one of their most dangerous operations and one of their most successful. In January 1945, as the tide of war turned once again, the Ghost Army received new orders. The next phase would take them into Germany itself. Their final mission would be the largest deception of the European campaign, and perhaps the most important of all. By now, the men had perfected their craft. They could deploy a fake division in just a few hours. They could imitate the movement of thousands of troops with fewer than 100 men. Their inflatable tanks had become more realistic, their soundtracks more complex, with layers of audio designed to mimic real convoys, tank columns, and artillery barrages. They were masters of illusion, armed with nothing but air and creativity. In March 1945, the Allies were preparing to cross the Rhine River, the last natural barrier, before the heart of Germany. It was a critical moment. If the Germans concentrated their defenses at the crossing point, the invasion could fail. So once again, the Ghost Army was called upon to create confusion. The mission was codenamed Operation Viersen. Its objective: convinced the Germans that the U.S. Ninth Army was preparing to cross the Rhine miles away from its actual location. The Ghost Army moved into position near the small towns of Anrath and Dalken. Over several nights, they inflated hundreds of tanks and trucks, broadcasted fake radio traffic, and projected recorded sounds of bridge construction. The deception was flawless. German reconnaissance aircraft spotted the fake buildup and reported it as genuine. Artillery was redirected to defend the false crossing point. Meanwhile, the real Ninth Army crossed the Rhine unopposed at another location. The operation was a complete success. It was the Ghost Army's masterpiece, their final illusion before victory. In the following weeks, as the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, the war began to collapse. The German army was in retreat, their cities in ruins. The deception unit had done its job. They had fought without weapons, and yet their impact was enormous. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army had conducted more than 20 major operations. There, illusions had drawn enemy fire, redirected entire divisions, and saved countless lives. But their story would remain a secret for decades. The U.S. Army classified the Ghost Army's existence, sealing their records under top-secret orders. Even their families were told nothing. For more than 40 years, the world never knew that an army of artists had helped win the war. Their service wasn't officially recognized until the 1990s, when the files were finally declassified. Only then did the truth come out. The photographs of inflatable tanks, the sketches made in the field, the recordings of their fake battle sounds, the ghosts were finally revealed. Yet even then few could believe it. How could art, design, and sound defeat one of the most powerful armies in history? But it was real. It had happened, and it had changed everything. By the time the Ghost Army crossed into Germany in the spring of 1945, their mission had become more than just military deception. For the men inside the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, it was a strange and haunting form of art, one that blurred the line between imagination and survival. They were painters and sculptors, designers and sound engineers, men who had spent their lives creating illusions for theaters and galleries. Now, their stage was the battlefield, and their audience was the enemy. Each of them knew that their work could save lives, but it could also cost their own. They operated close to the front lines, often without infantry protection. The decoy camps, filled with inflatable tanks and fake artillery, drew artillery fire from miles away. Sometimes the shells fell harmlessly on empty fields. Sometimes they didn't. Private Jack Marcy, a designer from Brooklyn, once described the eerie feeling of hearing German shells whistling overhead while standing beside a rubber tank. He said it felt like performing a play where the critics have guns. The men joked to hide their fear, but beneath the laughter was a quiet understanding that every illusion they built was a risk. Among the unit were men who would later become some of America's most respected artists and designers. Bill Blass, who would go on to become one of the most famous fashion designers in the world, spent his early 20s sewing camouflage netting and painting fake shadows on rubber vehicles. Ellsworth Kelly, who would later be recognized as a major figure in modern art, was part of the camouflage team. Arthur Singer, who became a celebrated wildlife painter, used his artistic precision to create convincing battlefield props. Even their commanding officer, Colonel Harry Reeder, often said, "I have the only army in the world where every man is a painter." The creativity of the Ghost Army was unmatched. When they weren't building decoys, they filled their sketchbooks with drawings of the war, portraits of soldiers, towns, and battlefields. They drew not only what they saw, but what they felt. Many of those sketches still exist today, vivid snapshots of a war fought with imagination. Their art captured something few war photographs ever could: the surreal beauty of deception and the loneliness of those who created it. Between missions, they found ways to stay sane. They staged small plays, improvised jazz performances, and painted murals on the sides of their trucks. In one camp, a group of men built a fake mess hall out of canvas and wood, complete with hand-painted signs that read, "Café Deception." They ate, joked, and lived inside their own illusion. Soldiers pretending to be artists, pretending to be soldiers. Their humor was a defense against the absurdity around them. They were constantly aware that they were fighting a war not with bullets, but with lies. Each operation was a performance that could turn deadly at any moment. They often compared themselves to magicians, but magicians who couldn't afford to make mistakes. And yet, their success depended on those small details that only artists could notice. The angle of a shadow on an inflatable tank, the placement of fake tire tracks in muddy ground, the rhythm of a truck engine recorded to match a real convoy's timing. They understood that deception worked only when it felt true. Every brushstroke, every sound, every signal had to be perfect. In the closing months of the war, when victory seemed near, the men began to reflect on what they had done. Some were proud, others were conflicted. They had built illusions to save lives, but they had also used their talents to deceive. It was a strange burden, knowing that the same creativity that once brought beauty into the world had now been turned into a weapon. One soldier, Sergeant Art Kane, wrote in his journal that deception was the purest form of art, because it had to be perfect or it would fail. He later became one of America's most iconic photographers. But even years later, he said that no photograph he ever took matched the intensity of what he felt during those nights in Europe when sound and shadow could shape the fate of nations. The Ghost Army's operations near the Rhine marked their final act in the war. After Operation Viersen succeeded, they began to prepare for demobilization. But even as the German army collapsed, the men were forbidden from speaking about their work. The secrecy was absolute. Their unit's existence was classified under top secret. They were told that if anyone asked what they had done, they should say they worked in camouflage. For most of them, that's exactly what they told their families. For the next 50 years, when they returned home after the war, they scattered across America. Some went back to art school, others became architects, teachers, or designers. A few stayed in the military, carrying their experience into new kinds of intelligence work. But all of them carried the same memory: the sound of fake battles echoing through empty fields, the strange silence after the last illusion faded. For decades, no one spoke of the Ghost Army. Even the men who had served in it sometimes wondered if people would believe them. Their war had left no monuments, no medals, no headlines, only stories. Stories of rubber tanks, phantom soldiers, and laughter in the dark. It wasn't until the 1980s that their story began to surface. A few veterans, now old men, gathered for reunions and began sharing their memories. They brought photographs and sketches, snapshots of fake tanks in muddy fields, drawings of soldiers blowing up rubber vehicles under a pale European sky. Historians who saw the evidence were astonished. The documents were real. The operations were real. The Ghost Army had truly existed. By the 1990s, the US Army officially declassified the unit's records. The truth finally came out. Between 1944 and 1945, the Ghost Army had staged more than 20 operations, saving an estimated 30,000 American lives. Their deceptions had diverted entire German divisions, bought precious time for Allied advances, and changed the outcome of key battles. Yet for most of their lives, no one had known. In 1996, a documentary filmmaker named Rick Bayer helped bring their story to light with the first detailed account of their operations. He interviewed surviving veterans who spoke for the first time about their secret missions. Many said they had never considered themselves heroes. They saw themselves as artists who had done what needed to be done. As one of them said, "We didn't kill people, we saved them. That was enough." The rediscovery of the Ghost Army story inspired a new generation to see art and creativity differently, not just as tools of expression, but as instruments of protection, strategy, and hope. Their work became a testament to how imagination can be just as powerful as firepower. In 2022, after decades of effort by historians and veterans' families, The surviving members of the Ghost Army were finally awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. Most of them were gone by then, but their legacy lived on. It was a recognition long overdue. For an army that had never fired a shot, yet helped win a world war, their story remains one of the most extraordinary examples of human creativity under pressure. They were artists asked to deceive, dreamers asked to protect, and ordinary men who made imagination their shield. In the end, the Ghost Army proved something timeless: that creativity can be as vital in war as courage, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who fight with nothing but their minds. When the war ended in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ghosts. Cities lay in ruins, armies dissolved into silence. And among the millions returning home were the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. But unlike most soldiers, they couldn't talk about what they had done. Their operations were sealed under top-secret classification by the US Army. No photographs could be shared. No stories could be told. Their unit didn't officially exist. They had lived for 2 years in a world of illusion, creating false armies, fake sounds, and phantom battles. And now, they were expected to disappear into ordinary life. For most of them, that's exactly what happened. The military stored their records in government archives, marked declassified upon review. But no one reviewed them, not for decades. For the intelligence community, however, the lessons of the Ghost Army were too valuable to forget. Their methods had proven that information could be weaponized, that war could be fought not just with guns and tanks, but with ideas. In the first years after the war, as the Cold War began to take shape, the United States and the Soviet Union both studied deception on a massive scale. New intelligence agencies emerged from the ashes of World War II. The CIA was founded in 1947, and with it came a new era of psychological operations: propaganda, misinformation, and covert influence. Behind these strategies lay the same principles the Ghost Army had used: control perception, manipulate belief, and shape the enemy's reality. Many of the artists and officers who had served in the Ghost Army were quietly recruited into these new intelligence efforts. Some joined the Office of Policy Coordination, the CIA's covert branch, responsible for propaganda and political warfare. Others worked in military research, helping to develop new camouflage systems, decoy technologies, and psychological training programs. The US Army established a new branch of warfare known as PSYOP, psychological operations, dedicated to influencing enemy morale, spreading false information, and manipulating the battlefield through perception. The very idea of information warfare began here. The Ghost Army's influence lived on, hidden beneath classified projects and secret budgets. But the new world of deception was darker. Where the Ghost Army had used illusions to save lives, Cold War deception was often used to control populations, distort truth, and fight ideological battles. The line between defense and manipulation blurred. Governments discovered that the same creativity that could protect soldiers could also shape entire societies. By the early 1950s, both the US and the Soviet Union had created programs inspired by wartime deception. In Moscow, Soviet officers studied Allied deception manuals and built their own Maskirovka doctrine, military camouflage, and disinformation on a national scale. In Washington, psychological warfare divisions experimented with propaganda broadcasts, fake news operations, and staged military exercises meant to confuse foreign intelligence. The war of illusions that began in Europe had not ended. It had simply changed shape. In secret laboratories, engineers built new generations of decoys, radar reflectors, inflatable missile launchers, and fake airfields designed to fool reconnaissance aircraft. Artists who had once painted camouflage nets now painted entire cities on radar screens. Sound engineers who had mimicked tanks on the battlefield were now recording fake radio transmissions to mislead spies. Deception had become a science. For the veterans of the Ghost Army, this transformation was both fascinating and unsettling. Some were proud that their work had influenced the future of intelligence. Others felt a quiet unease. They had created illusions to save lives, not to perpetuate endless paranoia. Their art had been an act of hope, not control. In the decades that followed, as the Cold War deepened, the legacy of the Ghost Army's creativity reappeared in unexpected places. During the Korean War, U.S. forces used inflatable artillery and sound deception to confuse enemy reconnaissance. In Vietnam, psychological operations used sound broadcasts, including simulated troop movements and fake voices in the jungle, techniques that traced their lineage directly back to 1944. Even in the Persian Gulf War of 1991, inflatable tanks and radar decoys were used once again, echoing the same tactics first tested by the artists of the Ghost Army nearly 50 years earlier. But the most profound legacy of their work wasn't military at all. It was human. The Ghost Army showed that imagination, that most fragile and human of abilities, could become a form of strength. In a world consumed by violence, creativity had been their shield. Their story might have remained hidden forever, if not for a few persistent historians and veterans who refused to let the ghosts fade. In the late 1980s, surviving members began to reunite. They brought photographs, sketches, and memories, fragments of a story no one had heard before. One of them, Sergeant John Jarvie, still had a roll of undeveloped film he had shot during the war. When it was processed decades later, the images stunned historians. Soldiers inflating tanks, smiling beside rubber jeeps, building decoy camps that looked indistinguishable from real ones. The myth became undeniable truth. By the 1990s, the U.S. government finally declassified the unit's files. For the first time, the Ghost Army's full operations were revealed. 21 major deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. More than 1,100 men impersonating entire divisions of over 20,000 troops. A record of success unmatched in military history. Documentaries, books, and exhibitions followed. Historians called them the most unusual army that ever existed. Art museums displayed their wartime sketches beside their camouflage work, blurring the line between art and survival. Students studied their techniques not as curiosities, but as examples of how creativity could solve problems under unimaginable pressure. And as the world entered the digital age, their story gained new relevance. Modern warfare had moved from trenches and tanks to screens and signals. Deception now traveled at the speed of light, through data, algorithms, and information. The same logic that guided the Ghost Army, control what your enemy sees, had become the foundation of modern cyber warfare. In a strange way, the artists of 1944 had predicted the future. They had understood something that would define the next century. That perception is reality, and whoever controls perception controls the world. When the last surviving members of the Ghost Army were honored in the 21st century, many of them could hardly believe that their secret work had become public. They had grown old in silence, never expecting recognition. Now, as their stories spread across classrooms, museums, and documentaries, they saw how their illusions had outlived them, how a handful of artists with rubber tanks and microphones had left a legacy larger than armies. As one veteran, Bernie Bluestein, said in his final interview, "We were just doing our job. We didn't think it was special, but looking back, maybe it was." Their work proved that history is not just written by those who fight, but by those who imagine. The Ghost Army's art was never about glory. It was about survival, courage, and the belief that creativity could overcome destruction. They fought with ideas instead of weapons, and in doing so they showed the world what the human mind is capable of when it refuses to surrender. When the Ghost Army faded into the silence of peacetime, their story didn't end. It transformed. What began as a wartime necessity had become something larger, a lesson in how the human mind itself could be used as a weapon. For centuries, armies had fought over land and power. The Ghost Army revealed something new: control perception, and you control everything. During the war, deception had been a matter of life and death. But in the decades that followed, it became something else entirely: a science. Psychologists, propagandists, and intelligence officers studied the Ghost Army's methods, not just for their tactical success, but for what they revealed about human nature. Why had the Germans fallen for such obvious tricks? How could entire divisions believe in an illusion so complete that even the simplest observation should have exposed it? The answer, they found, lay not in the skill of the deceiver, but in the mindset of the deceived. The German High Command had expected certain things: large American divisions, specific troop patterns, familiar radio codes. The Ghost Army simply gave them what they already believed to be true. That was the key, the foundation of all effective deception. The human mind doesn't see reality, it interprets it. It fills in the gaps, trusts patterns, and accepts what feels consistent. The artists of the Ghost Army had understood this instinctively. They weren't just tricking German reconnaissance, they were manipulating the expectations of an entire military system. They learned that belief could be engineered. After the war, those lessons became the foundation for what intelligence officers would later call perception management. The concept was simple. If you could control the information a person or a group received, you could control their behavior. In military terms, it meant you could move armies without firing a shot. In political terms, it meant you could move nations. Some of the Ghost Army's officers were invited to brief the newly formed CEA and Army Psychological Warfare Division. Their presentations were simple but profound. They explained that deception was not about lying. It was about telling the truth selectively. Show one part, hide another. Give your enemy just enough to believe the story you want them to see. The CIA adapted these principles into operations across the globe. In Italy, France, and later in Eastern Europe, propaganda networks began using the same techniques: sound, image, repetition, and plausibility. What the Ghost Army had done with rubber tanks and speakers was now being done with newspapers, radio, and cinema. The battlefield had moved from open fields to the human mind. Even in the art world, the echoes of the Ghost Army's philosophy began to appear. Many of its veterans returned to their studios and classrooms, bringing with them a subtle understanding of illusion and reality. Some, like Ellsworth Kelly, explore the relationship between perception and form in their paintings. Others, like Bill Blass, used visual deception in fashion, creating structure through design, illusion through simplicity. They had seen how vision could alter truth, and they carried that knowledge into every creative act for the rest of their lives. But while their legacy grew in silence, another kind of deception was emerging. The post-war years brought a new weapon: television. For the first time in history, images could be broadcast directly into people's homes. Governments, corporations, and political movements all realized the power of this medium. The same psychological triggers that had once fooled German generals were now influencing millions of viewers across the world. During the 1950s, propaganda became a global industry. The Cold War wasn't fought only with missiles and spies. It was fought through images, sounds, and stories. In the United States, the CIA funded cultural initiatives, art exhibitions, and radio programs to shape public perception of freedom and democracy. In the Soviet Union, state-run media created an alternate world, one where the truth was whatever the party said it was. Both sides had learned from the same source: the art of illusion. Deception had evolved. The Ghost Army had used rubber and sound to win a war. Now nations were using words and pictures to win hearts and minds. The battlefield had become invisible, but not everyone saw this as progress. Some of the Ghost Army veterans who followed the rise of Cold War propaganda felt uneasy. They recognized the techniques, but the purpose felt different. In 1944, they had used illusion to save lives. Now, illusion was being used to control thought. The line between protection and manipulation, between survival and control, was fading. Psychologists studying wartime deception began publishing theories that connected art, warfare, and behavior. They argued that all persuasion, whether in battle or advertising, relied on the same principles: attention, emotion, repetition, and belief. By understanding those patterns, one could influence anyone, anywhere. The Ghost Army had stumbled upon this truth by instinct, but now it was becoming a structured discipline. Deception was no longer just a tactic. It was becoming a science of influence. As the Cold War escalated, that science grew in sophistication. Entire divisions of analysts, artists, and engineers were hired to design what they called perception environments, simulations of reality so convincing that they could mislead entire populations. From fake military bases to staged political events, the methods pioneered by the Ghost Army became the blueprint for a new kind of global competition: information dominance. Even today, historians trace modern psychological operations, from the Gulf War's decoy campaigns to digital misinformation, back to the principles developed in those muddy fields of France in 1944. Control the image, control the sound, control the story, and you control the outcome. But the Ghost Army's true gift wasn't their technology, it was their humanity. They understood that deception could be used to protect, not just to destroy. Their illusions had bought time, saved soldiers, and brought an early end to a brutal war. They had used creativity to defend life, not manipulate it. As decades passed and technology advanced beyond their wildest dreams, one question lingered: had the world learned the right lesson from their work? In the 21st century, as information warfare became the new normal, the story of the Ghost Army returned, not as nostalgia, but as a warning. They had shown that illusion could save lives, but they had also shown how fragile truth could be when humans learned to shape it. The ghosts of that army still walk among us, not in the form of soldiers, but as reminders that every image we see, every sound we hear, every story we believe might be part of someone else's design. And just like the Germans in 1944, we might not realize it until it's too late. The story of the Ghost Army did not end with the fall of Nazi Germany, nor with the Cold War's uneasy peace. Their legacy, the art of illusion, lived on. But what began as a secret weapon to save lives had, over time, become something much greater and far more dangerous. In the 21st century, deception no longer required rubber tanks or canvas aircraft. It didn't need sound trucks or coded radio chatter. Today, illusion can be created with a screen, a signal, or a line of code. The battlefield that began in the fields of France has moved to the networks of the digital age. The principles, however, remain the same: perception, belief, control. The same psychology that made German generals believe in phantom divisions now guides the architects of digital propaganda and cyber warfare. The same visual tricks that fooled Luftwaffe pilots now appear in computer-generated imagery, false videos, and synthetic voices. The Ghost Army's descendants no longer wear uniforms. They wear headsets, sit behind monitors, and shape the world through information. Modern militaries have studied the Ghost Army for decades. In US training manuals, their work is referenced under a new term: military deception operations. But beyond the battlefield, their philosophy has become part of civilian life, woven into politics, advertising, entertainment, and even social media. In the age of instant communication, deception has become democratized. Anyone with a computer can create illusions now: fake images, fabricated news, manipulated videos, all built on the same foundation the Ghost Army discovered in 1944, that people believe what feels true, not what is. During World War II, deception took time, planning, and artistry. Every inflatable tank, every recorded sound required labor, skill, and secrecy. Now, a single keystroke can alter millions of perceptions in seconds. Technology has made deception faster, louder, and almost invisible. The Ghost Army's lessons echo everywhere, from political campaigns to corporate branding, from military strategy to social networks. The art of controlling perception has become a global industry worth billions. And in this new world, truth is often the first casualty. In modern warfare, deception is no longer about fooling the enemy army. It's about shaping public opinion. The wars of today are fought not just on land, air, and sea, but on screens, in headlines, and inside minds. False narratives can move stock markets, influence elections, or justify invasions. They can divide nations and turn neighbors into enemies, all without a single shot being fired. The Ghost Army once used sound and shadow to trick an enemy into retreating. Now, those same principles are used to make people doubt what they see with their own eyes. The battlefield has become personal. Each mind is a new front line. Governments, intelligence agencies, and private corporations all use the tools that grew from the Ghost Army's roots: psychological operations, influence campaigns, data manipulation, and behavioral engineering. It's not about creating fake tanks anymore. It's about creating fake truths. But not all uses of deception are sinister. In humanitarian crises, psychological operations have been used to protect civilians, to confuse terrorists, networks, and to prevent violence before it starts. Just as in 1944, deception can still save lives. It depends on who wields it and why. In 2013, NATO's Strategic Communications Center published a report on the origins of modern information warfare. At the top of its references were two names, Operation Fortitude and the Ghost Army. The report acknowledged them as the foundations of every deception doctrine still used today, proof that art, sound, and imagination had changed the nature of power itself. And yet in this new digital age, something has been lost. The Ghost Army's deceptions were grounded in empathy. They used illusion not to harm, but to protect. Their lies were meant to save lives, not to destroy truth. Today's world often reverses that balance. Deception has become detached from purpose. It is used to confuse, divide, and control. The tools once used by artists to mislead an army are now used by algorithms to mislead humanity. The same techniques that helped liberate Europe are now embedded in the feeds of billions of devices. Subtle manipulations that decide what people see, think, and believe. The battlefield is no longer between nations. It's within societies and within minds. But the Ghost Army story also reminds us of something hopeful, that creativity and intelligence can still be used for good. The same imagination that can deceive can also reveal. The same tools that manipulate can also enlighten. And in a world drowning in misinformation, the lessons of those artists may be more relevant than ever. In 1944, they proved that human imagination could alter the outcome of the greatest war in history. In 2024, imagination still has that power, though the war it fights now is for truth itself. One can almost imagine those artists, young men covered in mud, painting fake shadows on rubber tanks, looking at the modern world and smiling. They would recognize it instantly. The stage has changed, the lights are brighter, but the illusion remains the same. They were the first generation to weaponize creativity. And perhaps, if there is to be hope for the future, we must learn to wield it again, not to deceive, but to defend, to create not illusions of war, but realities of peace. Because in the end, the greatest deception of all may be the belief that truth cannot win. The Ghost Army has long since faded into history. The men who built illusions on the battlefields of Europe are gone now. Their voices quiet, their hands still. But their story remains, not just in archives or museums, but in the fabric of the world they helped shape. Because what they created was not only a deception, it was a mirror. They showed us something profound about ourselves, that human beings are creatures of belief. We build our worlds from perception, not from fact. We see what we expect to see, hear what we want to hear, and trust what feels familiar. The Ghost Army learned to shape those expectations, to sculpt belief itself, and in doing so, they revealed both the power and the vulnerability of the human mind. In the mud and chaos of 1944, they turned art into armor. They proved that imagination could be a weapon, that creativity could save lives in a world built on destruction. They fought not with hatred, but with brilliance, not with strength, but with illusion. Their victory was not measured in bodies or bombs, but in silence. The silence of battles that never happened, of lives that never had to be lost. But every illusion leaves a shadow, and the shadow of their work stretches far beyond the war they fought. It reaches into our own age, an age where illusions no longer need paint, sound, or smoke. Today, illusion flows through invisible wires and glowing screens. It shapes our news, our politics, our memories, even our sense of self. We live surrounded by mirrors, each one reflecting a version of the truth, each one asking us to believe. The Ghost Army would have understood this world, because in their time, they saw how fragile truth could be when belief was turned into a battlefield. They learned that the moment people stop questioning what they see, the illusion becomes real. And perhaps that is the final lesson they left us. The power of deception lies not in the lie itself, but in the willingness of others to believe it. The Ghost Army used that knowledge to protect the innocent, but in the wrong hands, it can enslave them. That is why their story matters now more than ever. Every artist, every journalist, every storyteller faces the same question the Ghost Army did. What is truth worth? And what are you willing to do to protect it? Their work reminds us that truth, like art, must be created, shaped carefully, defended constantly, and questioned always. It reminds us that imagination can be a force for peace, not just for war. And it reminds us that sometimes, to save the world, you have to trick it first. When the surviving members of the Ghost Army were honored in Washington decades after the war, one of them, a quiet man named Seymour Nussenbaum, stood at the podium, his voice trembling with age. He said, "We were artists sent to fight with paint and sound. We never expected anyone to remember us. But maybe, just maybe, they will remember what art can do." That sentence lingered in the room long after he stepped away. Because what art can do, what imagination can do, is limitless. It can build, it can heal, it can deceive, and it can save. The Ghost Army's illusions are gone now. The rubber tanks have rotted away. The recordings have gone silent. But their message remains clear. Truth and deception are twins, born of the same human need, the need to make sense of chaos. The difference lies in the purpose. They used illusion to reveal truth. Today, we must learn to use truth to reveal illusion. In a world built on shifting realities, their story stands as both warning and inspiration, that even in the darkest hours of war, imagination can bring light, that even in a world of lies, creativity can be an act of courage, and that sometimes the ghosts we remember are the ones who remind us how to be human. This was the unknown zone, where the past still speaks, and the truth hides in plain sight.